Hello there. Thanks for tuning in to another episode with me talking about legalization, decriminalization, or depenalization. Most of the world has experienced prohibition for the last century, and it's been grossly unjust. I'm preaching to the choir. I know to 99.99% of the people watching this. And I think it's worth bearing in mind how the process has played out in the various regions where we do have a version of legalization or tolerance or decriminalization, and better yet, depenalization. And I think with the Canadian experience, I think one of the earlier constitutional challenges was from the Church of the Universe brothers from, I believe, around Guelph, Ontario. And these guys were trippers. I remember being on the Cannabis Cup trip with them, actually, with Cannabis Canada at the time in Amsterdam. But yeah, interesting. But yeah, those guys, gave it a solid shot, but it didn't do it. And I think, it's still all the credit to everybody that ever pushed, because it's, the final challenges that start to win, they're also, supported by the incremental gains of everybody that's pushing earlier on too. One of the early ones I remember in my lifetime really was Chris Clay. He had a shop in London, Ontario, and he started selling clones in the front window, really as an act of civil disobedience, because at that time there was, police parked out front of the grow stores, and so everybody had to send a friend or something to go get their supplies. And it was really a very anti-cannabis time, Prohibition. And it was very brave of him to start selling cuttings in the front window of his shop with the, I think he had a 400 watt or something burning in the windows. I mean, it was readily apparent. And yeah, I think he was represented by Alan Young out of Toronto, who was always a committed cannabis lawyer. And, at the end of the day, their constitutional challenge didn't, succeed in making cannabis legal, but it definitely laid the groundwork for the next ones. And I remember Chris was selling freedom bonds, I think he called them. I forget what they were called, but they were $25 for a quarter ounce certificate, redeemable within 6 months of legalization, or after six months after legalization. So he'd have time to grow it out. So I remember somewhere in a book, maybe an old mushroom cultivator book or grow guide or something, I bought 4 of them. I was a student at the time, so $100 wasn't nothing to me at the time, but I was happy. I said, if every pothead put $100 towards the constitutional challenge or something in their area, I mean, we would have had legalization a long time ago. So it doesn't have to be one person putting in millions. It can be millions of people putting in 100. You could really move the needle. Anyway, that was a minor contribution on my part, but I still remember, it felt like, man, if everybody would do this, we would be done already, but it has to be behind the right efforts for sure. So anyway, that was a noble endeavor, and he was a cool guy. And then later, I remember Randy Kane. He had got a possession charge with a roach, maybe down in White Rock or somewhere, and he took it all the way to fight this, adult possession charge, because all he had was a roach. And John Conroy, QC, was his lawyer, and I was so impressed with them doing it And at the time I had a grow shop, so I had a little bit of scratch in my pocket. And I remember I donated them $1,000, and I hadn't met either of them, but then both of them came out to visit with me, and we had a good sesh, and John and Sherry came out for some house parties, and we stayed in touch after that. And amazing to see, but they weren't the final ones, I think, to get it over the border, or the finish line, as it were, which in some ways was really the starting line. But of legalization in Canada, we go back up a little bit. First, you saw the hemp license, and the guy, Jeff Keim and Joe Strobel, got the first hemp license kind of in our time that didn't count like research crops at the research station in Ottawa. So they got that rolling, and I had met Jeff and turned him on to hemp. We were in line for Grateful Dead tickets on Dundas Street in front of Sam the Record Man back in London. And, you know, we were hanging out for hours there, and I said, you got to go get this book. The Emperor Wears No Clothes, you know, and he got totally into it. And we hung out and we jammed, and saw him at a show one time, that same show down in Buffalo. But either way, we hung out for a few years, and he, you know, went all the way with it. And he had land, you know, he was from a family in the country with a fair bit of land. So and also with an industrial background. So it was great to see him run with that and get the hemp started. And then after hemp starts to get recognized and people realize, okay, hemp is lots of uses. Okay, it's not all marijuana, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, hemp is important. Hemp does a lot of things, but it doesn't need to have a THC limit to do those things, you know, so that's quite unfortunate for the species as a whole, I think. But regardless, the hemp helps normalize it. So I think in countries like Germany, say you had hemp, then you have medical, and then it becomes more the adult use scenario, bit by bit. And there's all these different examples of how that's happened. And yeah, it's something to see, because, you know, we saw that in Canada where you see the hemp, then later some strong activist in Vancouver set up a compassion club, the BC Compassion Club, and helped, you know, inspired by Dennis Perrone, who'd been up to visit. And yeah, it was a really heady time, I would say, in the mid-90s then. And then other places started to spring up, or other activists would come forward that they were going to grow for, you know, really sick people that needed the meds. And that alone is beautiful, but the medical and, you know, the medical necessity of that plant even, you know, became undeniable. And so eventually the government starts to work on regulations for that. And to start with, they had a horrible program where they licensed one company called Prairie Plant Systems, and they grew in a mine in Flin Flon, Manitoba, and it was utter trash. And they would homogenize their product by chopping up the whole plant, stem, leaf, flower, everything, and mincing that up into shake. And that would be the meds they would sell. And you say, well, they really don't take this seriously, you know, like there's no respect for the plant. And I was quite irritated too, because I'd had a bunch of seeds seized that the RCs donated to this company, and they got to grow out all these stolen seeds basically. So that was quite irritating. It was salt in the wound, I thought. You know, it's one thing that we managed to keep it alive. You know, they would have made that species extinct had they had their way. And, you know, those of us that were pushing back on that, it was very maddening to see them, you know, take the work and then hand it off to a private company. Regardless, it it was, you know, not, a way to inspire any love for the state. Let's say that. I was more than a little irritated. Anyway, once you start seeing that medical getting around, they had to keep changing it because that one company, the patients weren't satisfied with that, with the trash they were doing, of course, and so they had different incarnations, like a MMAR and a MMPR. It might have been MMPR, MMAR, ACMPR. I didn't get involved in any of those. The MMPR was all to make corporate cannabis, essentially. There wasn't really room for ma and pa at that stage. So you could do it, but I think at the time it was kind of given that you needed a minimum $15 million to even consider getting into it. And it was like, because it's, all the original MMPR regulations required people having, bank vaults for storage and all this just over the top stuff. And you think that's all going to be sunk capital because they can't keep it like this forever. This isn't practical. Like the regs just were unwieldy and really overblown. So then they had to devolve some power to the people, and they gave them the MMAR, which allowed a role for caregivers to grow for other people or patients to grow their own. And for a lot of people, that was kind of their ticket to being legal, even if they're, just in the homegrown and like the taste of it camp. That's beautiful. But they could say, I need it for insomnia or whatever. And lots of people, of course, I'm not knocking true medical need, but I'm saying, and a lot of people say too, that all use can be considered medical because, prevention is the best medicine, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the cure, and laughter is the best medicine. So people can have a healthier life enjoying it potentially. And if that's what they feel and that's what they believe, that's their choice, really. And letting people grow their own was really essential. And I'd often heard it phrased as forcing us to buy it is like saying you can't cook at home, you can only eat in restaurants. And that's really, it comes down to, it's not necessarily home cooked meals every night. You can eat very well in restaurants, don't get me wrong, but it's nice to have the option to cook at home if you want, and you definitely save a lot of money cooking at home and growing your own. So if the prices are obscene, which often that's how it starts out in the regulated markets, because there's so much additional layers of expense, the cost of compliance, fees, punitive taxation. So like often cannabis starts out very expensive in the regulated markets, and then it drops and drops, because ultimately why it was expensive to begin with before it was a regulated market was because it was a black market and there was consequences to getting caught doing it. So there was a risk premium involved. So when legalization first comes and then the risk premium evolves into a legal premium, that it's actually more expensive on the legal market than it was on the black market, and we've seen that happen, then it's something's wrong, because if you're gonna, the price should go down once it's legal. You can have it go in both directions, actually, because now you've got a wider spread. A grower or producer can market wider. So if you have something very exclusive, it could end up going for a lot more. And if you're playing to the masses, you've got to have a great value product, and there's, a whole lot to be said for that. But the thing about legalization is we wanted to see it so long and, everywhere. But when you start to see it, you got to remember there's something of, you got to be careful what you wish for, because the devil's in the details. So you can say, yeah, legalize it. We want a legal herb. And that's true. We want legal herb. But what are the strings attached? So if they're doing punitive levels of taxation, barriers to entry that are just obscene. You don't want to see it so much market consolidation that it's like the 2 or 3 tobacco cartel members in your nation, that, and nobody else can do it. That's not a great model. And decriminalization, it doesn't really go far enough to me, because under decriminalization, you can still get civil fines. If you don't pay your civil fines, you're still going to end up in the same jail. So I don't believe decriminalization's enough. Plus, it doesn't allow the consumer to, shop with trusted brands and buy it openly, we're at any shop, whether it's a pharmacy or a liquor store or a tobacco shop, corner store, it doesn't matter. If you like Coca-Cola, you can find it consistently. So there'll be big brands like that that are known for their consistency across markets. There's also going to be specialized ones that make super high-end product that's highly sought after, and the average person will never get to try it. That stuff's going to go for an arm and a leg. But in decriminalization, it's still a gray market. So there isn't that mainstream recognition of brands necessarily, that you can come to trust certain brands or certain shops. You say, I know this shop doesn't sell anything that's not blind tested. We know it's all, clean herbs that they have, or clean products. So, but if it's in the gray market or black market, you don't necessarily have that assurance of a brand, because everything's in a brown paper bag or a Ziploc bag, as the case may be, right? So that doesn't go far enough with the decrim. This is why I coined the term depenalization, because I thought, yeah, it's still unacceptable that you could get a fine or have your plants ripped out of your yard or something. So decrim, not enough. Legalization can be, depends how it's worded, can be great. But if it's not done well, then it's kind of a prohibition 2.0, where they come up with more ways to charge it, like they did in Canada. I think it went from 6, cannabis crimes to 36 or something. So it's, they can over-regulate it, is there a big risk of legalization, that's for sure. But depenalization, it's like, just leave it alone, make it a non-issue. Like if you're selling a brand of echinacea, which is another endocannabinoid tickler, nobody cares you're selling a brand of echinacea. If people like echinacea, I really like that Spice of Life echinacea. I make tea with it every day. It's so soothing. It could really be a non-issue. If you want to get your echinacea certified organic, get it certified organic. It doesn't even deserve to be taxed like alcohol or tobacco. It should be in the herbal remedies section. It's really fine if it's sold besides cigars. If you've got blunts and cigars for sale in the same shop, I don't have a problem with that. And the thing is, also with cannabis liqueurs or infusions, people didn't want to see them. Like in Canada, there was a lot of talk about what the Cannabis Act would look like. And there was lots of spirited online debate, let's say. And there was polls, and it was talk about, do you want to be able to buy this in liquor stores or not? And the overwhelming majority was for not being able to buy it in liquor stores. But I just would shake my head. A, I'm not allergic to liquor, but B, even if you just like cannabis, there can still be cannabis-only stores. But having cannabis available to the drinkers seems like a great idea, doesn't it? Don't you want them to have the opportunity to pick up some gummies at the checkout? What do you care? Not them, because many of those drinkers are never going to set foot in a pot shop. But if the pot went into the bottle shop, tons of them would try it, And a wise man once told me, he said, the way to the straight people's hearts is through their bottles. So, if you make a creme de ganja that's just delicious, and you can have shooters and do recipes. Cannabis is so versatile as an ingredient and as a flavoring and as, a medicine and a social lubricant and, inspiration. It's used for so many reasons by so many people in so many cultures all over the world that you can, really start to compare once you have a good look around. And I do have some experience going to different places because I'd always said if I could do it legally, I'll move and do it. I'll pay the taxes, whatever. So the first time I left Canada to grow, I moved to Switzerland in 99. And at the time, it was really on a canton by canton basis, but the plants themselves were not illegal, but the uses for them could be. So that was the Swiss saying, we're not going to start making plants illegal because where does it end? Swiss botanical research is huge. We can't say you can grow this, you can't grow that. They said, but on the other hand, we're not Amsterdam. There's no hash bars here. Selling joints is illegal, but selling the flower isn't. So it was a very interesting time because while there was an element of prohibition involved, the actual cultivation and breeding and flower sales at any scale required no license, and just regular business rules apply. Apply for a business license, get your electrical inspected, just normal business stuff. And we even got all employee taxes back at the end of the year because we were designated an export company. 97% of our sales were export. If you were designated an export manufacturer, you got a refund at the end of the year of all your employee taxes. So that was, it just felt so good to be so normal. And you would see clones for sale at mainstream supermarkets right out front in May with all their other plants, bedding plants, vegetables, whatever, strawberries. So you could just go pick up a tray of clones, and you could pick up hemp or you could pick up cannabis, and they all had color photo color tags with each plant. So if you got a tray you would have all the little plastic plant tags with a picture of a marigold and says plant full sun, harvest mid-October, heavy feeder, water when dry, just the basic plant tag stuff, the little symbols. And it was just normal. Nobody blinked. I was the tourist sitting there when I first got there in May of 99 and looking around like, it's just normal. Like nobody cares. It's just there. And the Swiss as a whole are fairly introspective people, and they're really just concerned with what they're doing and what's happening in their lives, and they're not so stressed about what everybody else is doing. Like they pretty much ignore everybody else. There's a real leave me aloneism, much as in BC, well, traditionally. Anyway, it's so refreshing to switch culture and see, my God, that was really like the only developed nation, let's say, it was where you could go and do cannabis breeding or production at scale, just as though it were tomatoes. So I remember when I got there in 99 thinking, boy, in 10 years, the rest of the world's going to be like this. And I was so wrong, and even they went backwards. So that was unfortunate. So they do have an experimental legalization rolling out now with a limited number of licenses, I think. And I'm not sure the progress. I talked to a friend there recently in Zurich, and he said the progress is very slow, but something's happening. So, but it's too bad that it's not like it used to be, because it really was the ideal. Could have been more ideal if you had, extracts were allowed, and if there was hash bars and smoking was allowed, it wasn't like that. It was more just the cultivation and breeding, which was good enough for me. I just really wanted to go there and be able to plant fields to do selections in and do crosses indoors through the winter or additional generations, and then try them all outside again in the summer. So I really, really enjoyed that time there. And then when I moved back to Canada, it was definitely, I was switching gears anyway to out of the cannabis industry for a while, and I made wine. And part of the reason was because I thought, well, probably when they legalize it, it'll be kind of like wine. So let me try that, because that's one, it's still overregulated as alcohol, I would say, because it's just herb. But I thought, realistically, that's how it may play out. You have some big monster ones and you'll have little family ones. And I thought, if I get some experience getting a winery license and, doing the production and reporting and that, and there was a grapes to wine reporting. So there's all this, parallel universe, which I've talked about in another episode, but it struck me as a bit of a potential training ground for what legalization might look like. So as the farm gates have started to open up, originally there wasn't farm gates, so the small producers were really caught between a rock and a hard place because they could only either sell to larger competitors or the province, and that narrows your choices a lot. So if you're a small producer, you really need direct access to consumers, and hopefully not just through their shops, but online even, because a small producer that can sell nationwide online could really grow. So there's a lot of restrictions, and I do feel, a sense of sympathy to a certain degree for many of the participants in the legal markets, because where they're taxed to death and, death by a million paper cuts in that. And I know it sucks the life out of it. Like, it's not only that, it's not really lucrative for them. So a lot of them, the government makes more money from their operations than they do. So that's kind of an awkward partner to have, because they don't do anything but throw up roadblocks and make your life more complicated, but then they also want the lion's share of your profits. So to me, that's just not appealing. That I just don't want to work under those conditions. But, I'd be happy to give them sales tax, but like not all these invented new taxes for it. Like when we said legalize it and tax it, we meant legalize it and sales tax it. We didn't mean legalize it and invent 6 new taxes to levy on it. It's just really brutal. So anyway, the great outliers, you can still grow your own. You can have in Canada, in most provinces, but federally, you can have 4 plants, which is enough for the average person, but it's not realistic if you like to have a number of flavors, or if you don't grow all the time. If you just grow in the summer and then consume it the rest of the year, 4 plants, it's not a lot of choice as far as flavors in your jars. And you might not get any more growing 12 small ones or 20 smaller ones, but you'd have more diversity in your flavors. But regardless, it's better than none, which is what we were allowed. So and I think it's, up to 4 is okay unless your neighbors complain or blah, blah, blah. There's a few different, ins and outs around it. And then if you're growing between, 5 and 12 plants, I believe there's a $1,500 fine possible. And if you're growing over 12 plants, then you risk 6-month mandatory minimum and the $1,500 fine. So a lot of people still have their MMAR licenses, which, as I said, I never had one. And I've always believed you don't need a better reason to grow cannabis than you like the smell of it, the look of it, the taste of it. I don't think you need any more justification than that. So that's always stuck with me, that, fundamentally, if I'm a guest in another country, especially, I feel like, okay, well, I'm here of my own choice, so I best respect their regs. Whereas if I'm in the land where I was born, then I feel a little more, flexible in my attitudes towards their authority because, I didn't sign up for it. I didn't agree to it. It's, the limits they're theirs, not mine. But I don't need the hassle either. So I mind my P's and Q's basically. And I really do just grow for myself. And I just do it in the summer. So I share some with friends, but I'm not selling any. I haven't sold any in Canada since the 90s. So I'm happy just to consume it and share it and enjoy it and not be part of the industry here right now. And hopefully, in the future, they start to be more realistic about the tax rates and stuff, and then it may be more attractive. But I know, a lot of us that were expecting legalization 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when we're looking at it, we're thinking the first wave might not be the best wave to catch because there's going to be tons of froth, is not necessarily ideal. So there's something to be said, the whole first mover advantage thing in that, but if you've been doing it long enough, I think you're not as worried about that because you really had the first mover advantage. But it's also is not advisable to jump in every jurisdiction that legalizes because some of them are more viable than others. So an interesting example I would like to mention is Thailand, because we started there about 5 years ago with the hemp license, which was the original thing they had, a hemp license, and there was only four outfits in the country that were able to grow THC, and they were all government related or royal related. There was a royal project that came up with 4 royal cultivars. Anyways, very interesting, different situation in Thailand. And then as the hemp and CBD was really taking off there at the time, but cannabis was still illegal and there wasn't really wide open shops yet or anything. And then we started to sense, you could see what was happening politically in the country. And there was a move towards more openness and including THC. And eventually they descheduled it, but they still put controls on extracts. So the flower itself was basically a food grade herb again, or a food herb, let's say. So it wasn't stressed that it wasn't being tested or anything like that. It was really a little bit Wild West, which is preferable to over-regulated in any sense because you can, buyer beware, right? It was so refreshing though to drive down, like from that country, from one visit to other. One time, cannabis still hidden. Next time we come back, grandma and grandpa are selling beer cups with 30 centimeter plants in the traffic, but they're just walking down the freeway in traffic jams selling plants to people. And you're seeing people setting up shop with just popping up a table and pulling out some jars of bud and jars of pre-roll, and they would do it on the sidewalk. They would do it under the stairs in the mall. You just see them everywhere selling weed. There was food trucks that were converted to sell weed, and they would get in trouble if they didn't have like a food truck permit, like a vendor's permit, and they didn't care that they were selling weed. They could have been selling pizza slices, but they still needed the vendor's permit. But anyway, it just became very wide open. But a lot of the Thai society, they've been, raised against it for so long that that's not easy change for them culturally. And a lot of them wanted to see it get tightened up. So eventually, there was some push me, pull me action there between conservative elements, and they ended up toning it back and now require that the crops to be sold get Thai GACP, which is Good Agricultural Collection Practices. You have different GACPs in different countries, or BPAs in Spanish, Buena Práctica Agrícola. But the Thai experience, so now products have to be grown GACP facility and tested at a recognized lab. And then they have to be sold in shops that have a pharmacy license and a doctor on hand are available. And anywhere it's going to be consumed, there has to be a doctor on hand. So they've definitely tried to put it back in the medical box, let's say, but the culture is not going away. They'll track how much you're buying. If you get a prescription, they're supposed to have like a unified system, so they see that people aren't buying more than 30 or 50 grams a month or something. I forget what the number is, but it's a little tighter than it used to be. But it hasn't gone away. And anything, it's probably going to help a lot of them, because once they start getting the certifications and getting the record keeping down, then they can start looking at export opportunities. So I know European importers that are pulling their hair out a little bit dealing with the Thais that are new to this, but they're going to take to it like fish to water once they get through the hurdles. I was talking to a German friend today that's an importer, and he's got an audit with a Thai company tomorrow to check if they have all the record keeping right and whatnot, to make it worthwhile to go through all the hoops to bring it into Europe. So anyways, we'll see. But I think it's overall fine. But, for the record, I don't think anybody should be prohibited from growing in their gardens and selling in their driveways. If you want to buy it from your neighbor, that's fine with me. I couldn't care less. And if you want to, go to a farm stand or a farmer's market and people selling their untested flower there, that's up to you. If you're like, oh, I know Rasta Bob, we smoke together, there's no way he sprays, pesticides or fungicides on his weed. He smokes more of it than anybody. Hey, fine with me, good enough. Go ahead, support Rasta Bob's farm stand. You don't need to have a pharmaceutical company to get cannabis out there. I have nothing against pharmaceutical grade cannabis, but I think you can have pharmaceutical and you can have food grade. And that's plenty reasonable. Not everybody needs boy in the bubble grade. And at the end of the day, the consumer can check the herb and buy a stalk off the rack for all I care. I'd even like to see, fields where it's you pick, because growing a field of cannabis is a lot of fun, is not that much work if you're not trying to grow monster plants and have to cage them and tie them up and everything. If you keep them a decent size, like at the sort of a comfortable natural size, most of them will make it through without a lot of care, especially if, they're on the shorter side. They don't need staked up in that. So I think there's something to be said for that, just sort of, human-sized plants. I know humans come in different sizes, but, if you saw even just 5-foot plants, 6-foot plants, it could be a thick little 4-footer, but you could have on a 4x8 spacing, if you planted an acre, you'd have about 2,000 plants an acre. So if you had all these little Christmas trees out there and people could come and buy a plant for $100, then you don't have to harvest it, hang it, air condition it, dehumidify it, trim it, package it. Takes out all of that, which is the biggest job. Planting a field of weed is not a huge job. It can be done fairly quickly. You can plant a field of herb. but harvesting it and trimming it is a ton of work. So I think it would be an ideal compromise for people that, live in apartments or don't have somewhere to grow their herb maybe, but they still want to get in on some value herb. Because you can have stunning outdoor if you're in the right zones and you grow the right plants for the zone. You can have stunning outdoor, and those plants, they're probably 4 to 8 ounces. Those 6 footers, depending on the plant. So if you just think, even if they're 4 ounces or 6 ounces, that's a great deal for $100, but you got to trim it and hang it up. I think people would be pretty excited to come. Plus, they get to come and pick them out, just like they're going to the Christmas tree yard and say, "Oh, I want this one." Dad, can we get this one? No, but you go. Load up the back of your mini wagon or whatever, your minivan, strap them to the roof of your station wagon, and take home your weed and trim it yourself. And that is one happy farmer, because now if he sells them $100 a plant, that's 200 grand an acre. So you got to have 10 acres doing 2 million a year. And this was the dream of Dave Watson. So this was his numbers exactly. He said, you got to have the 4x8 spacing, 2,000 plants an acre. And then you could, from 10 acres, you make 2 million a summer without having to have a barn to hang it and everything. I'm like, that is a really good idea. Because I was always thinking you rub hash farms where you just let people go in, charge them by the hour or whatever, and they can go in there and get their hands black. But of course, you're trashing the buds to be doing that. And you'd need a lot to have a high population of people come through. But with the Christmas tree farm model, where everybody just comes in and cuts down their favorite 4, I mean, people would show up with Rubbermaids and just stack the branches in them so the buds are all pointing up and not getting squished. People could have a great time with it. I think it would be fun. And, I think it will help normalize it, to have it more open and hands-on for people to come to the farm. It's interactive. And especially you go around the farm and maybe there's 30 different, types growing there. So you can say, oh, well, these ones over here, these are CBD ratio ones. These ones are all THC. These ones are more the narrow leaf, dominant ones. And you could have it sectioned up and people could be, oh my God, I really love the smell of this little one. What's this? What, peanut butter breath? Okay, I'll take one of those. And then, that's it. It's just pick your plants. So people would love that. I think there would be a waiting list of people to get in, especially if they could kind of see it from a distance driving by, and you'd maybe post, lots of pictures of the different ones as they're developing. And then you say, the doors open September 21st at 9:00, get your reservation code, because we're only letting in 20 cars at a time or something like that, so it could be a real event in the fall. Like people like to go wine touring. I think they could go cannabis touring all year round as well. And, lots of them are going to want to see indoor gardens behind the glass or greenhouses. But to be able to go and cut your own plants down to take home, and it be bargain plants, people are going to get a kick out of that, I think. I don't know. What do you think? You tell me down below if you're into that sort of thing. The so I'm sure I'm missing more. There's lots to could talk about this forever. Like in Holland, you had almost decriminalization, or a certain tolerance where the possession was okay, but there was nowhere for those who sell it to acquire it. So they were constantly in breach. So it wasn't really a workable system, although people made it work as they will, but it wasn't ideal. And now the Dutch are doing their legalization experiment with tightly licensed producers and shops that can sell these legally produced products now. So it's interesting to see they're moving from the tolerant kind of semi-decrim model to a legalized model, but still very much a hybrid system for now, at least. So we see in Germany, they've got social clubs, but there's a lot of pushback against the social clubs. And, every time somebody tries to design a system, there's a degree of utopia involved. And in the social club system in Germany, if I recall, there was a maximum of 500 members, and the members could buy 50 grams a month, and therefore the club could grow 25 kilos a month, if memory serves. And I think they could even share grows, like split up a warehouse 5 ways between 5 clubs or something, so they could harvest 125 kilos a month in a warehouse. And I'm not 100% sure on the details, but we will be talking to a German friend again tomorrow. Well, it might not be tomorrow, depending when you listen to this. Regardless, we'll have more details on the German situation. But essentially, even before they had clubs, they had medical, and most of that medical was imported and still is, and that was available through pharmacies. Originally, it was very expensive, and health insurance was paying for it, but eventually their market became fairly saturated. Not as much as other places like Canada, because there's more stringent requirements for the German pharmacy market, namely that products have to be EU GMP, and they may get imported to a neighboring country as GACP and then packaged under EU GMP conditions, and then they make it in. There's roundabout things happening, but it's all interesting. But the UK is a very different market. Spain doesn't know if it's coming or going. They really haven't opened up a domestic market for medical or adult use, but it's long been fairly tolerated, and the social club scene is pretty strong there. So the German social clubs, I think part of the problem with that 50 grams a month is not everybody that smokes weed smokes 50 grams a month. That's a fair bit of cannabis, So I think there's a lot of lightweights that they might smoke 5 grams a month or even less, So they don't want to sign up to a club to commit to 50 grams a month unless they're pretty chronic and fairly well off, because, that's lots of weed to be buying, I guess. The better thing is that each adult in Germany is allowed 3 plants. So a couple has 6 plants. And the home grow scene has just exploded in Germany. Even a year ago or so, they were sold out of tents and pots and potting soil and fertilizers, like lights. Anything to do with setting up a small home grow was sold out. It became incredibly popular, and seeds followed. And the Germans are allowed to import seed from anywhere within the EU, but not outside the EU. So I've been able to have seed legally imported to the Netherlands, but I'm not allowed to sell them within the Netherlands. So it works out that I could bring seed in that was certified for export, not necessarily certified seed, but seed that's legally recognized for import-export purposes. So these, the pathway is there for legal seed business in the EU. So, I'm happily involved with that on my own little level, but it's constantly evolving market. And the same, like just the beginning of this year, the Czech Republic opened up for home grow, and I can't remember the limits there. It might be like Germany with 3 plants a person or 6 plants a household or something, but it is a fairly small amount, but it is the only option for Czechs. So in a market like Canada that's very wide open and there's pot shops on every corner, homegrown's not as popular as it was during Prohibition, because now people can just walk down to the corner store and pick out something from hundreds of products. So they just love the convenience. One of my friends, I was trying to get her into growing her own, and she said, for me, I think you enjoy it more, even if you make your own vape carts with your own rosin, and you'll have a lot of fun. And she's like, oh, it's just the convenience. I just like walking into a shop and buying it. I don't give a shit about growing it. So I guess most people don't like making tomato sauce. It's easy enough to do, but if you're just happy with a jar from the store, have a jar from the store. That's what most people are always going to do. If they can get it easily and immediately, that's the bigger part of the battle, I think, for most people. So in places where cannabis is easily available to everyone, there's not a huge demand for seeds, especially because growers can also buy clones. So in a black market where you can't openly sell clones, then the seed sales do a lot better because people can't buy clones, unless they know somebody, right? If they're just looking at something online, they can order seeds. That's easy. But if they can just buy weed, lots of them won't grow in the first place. But even if they do, if they have access to clones, they still probably won't buy seeds. So, and then Canada did the craziest thing by taxing cannabis seeds at minimum $1 excise per seed. So they treat the seed like a gram of cannabis. So a gram of cannabis is taxed $1 per gram excise tax, or 10% of the sale price, whichever's more. So they don't tax tobacco seeds or poppy seeds or any other seeds $1 a seed. So, I mean, you've got to buy the excise stickers. If you were going to sell seeds in Canada, you have to buy the excise stickers when you're packaging the seed. So you haven't sold it yet, but you've got to pay the tax on it before you sell it, just to package it. So I just think it's just too much overreach, in my opinion. For the people that want to do it, I wish them all the best. And there is lots of potential success to be had breeding legally. But as far as selling seeds here, I don't see it right now. I don't know if there's any actual seed companies that make a go of it as seed companies. They might be able to do it as a extension of their production, where they're growing flower for sale or extracts for sale, and then they have the genetics as a sideline, or just to have their own proprietary lines, which is smart. That's good business. In the long run, differentiation is very important for these brands, more than they realize. Most of them want to grow what's popular, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And I always think of that as like a one design race, and everybody's, running under the same parameters, let's say, and then it becomes who does it best. And that's fun unto itself. But straight up, if you've got something in your jar that nobody else does and you make that popular, that's even better, from a straight up brand point of view. Nobody's going to degrade the name of that. People get sick of anything. It's like, I always say, it's popularity is the kiss of death. So once you're growing something really special, everybody wants it, you share it, suddenly lots of people are growing it that maybe don't try as hard as you do, and end up with product that you wouldn't be excited about and you wouldn't want to put your name on it. And that takes away from the name of your genetics. So as a breeder, holding something back for production under your label, I think is going to be a lot of fun for a niche, because you can create the demand for your new line, and you got to prove it. You got to win some awards with it and get lots of sexy bud shots and videos and close-ups and get all over it. But have a killer product. Like, just know that we grow this perfect, we cure it perfect, we package it gently, and they're getting it the way you want them to see it. They're never getting the B version of it, the Timu version of it, let's say, Whereas if you put that clone out into the wild, there's going to be garbage versions of it are going to become synonymous with it. So that is, a little bit off topic, but it's just one of the things to look out for once you're transitioning into the legal market, let's say. So I wish everybody all the best, whether they're in the legal market, black market, gray market, or no market at all, because just doing homegrown is so satisfying. And, I'll never, think it's not, because it's just a pleasure. And yeah, that's the first thing for any legalization, depenalization. Home growers' rights have to be at the top of the list, because anything that excludes homegrown is already broken. It's just not doable. People have to be able to grow their own. It's an inherent right of our species to grow that species on the planet we share. So we're all earthlings, and governments think they have a right to legislate the extinction of a useful species. They don't have the right to legislate the extinction of any species. So government, I'm not a big fan. Gotta say, not a big fan. But wherever you are in the world, you've got an uphill battle with cannabis legalization. There's very few places where you can comfortably grow your own and live to talk about it publicly. And hopefully we can inspire more people to demand the same rights, because I would love to go to Japan and go on a tour of great cannabis grown there, because I have no doubt the Japanese would grow great cannabis. And, with the care, the attention to detail that they're famous for, and their bonsai and lots of their agricultural pursuits, they're really perfectionists. And I think, man, and it's got such a long history in Japan too. It was really all over the place until the Americans set up camp there. So it would be great to see a real renaissance of it. And I do know that there are people working towards that. And it's always inspiring, because the places that it's the hardest, you got to be brave to move the needle back there. So, nothing but respect for the people that are still fighting for the right to have their cannabis in any form. But if you think of all the tragic prisons where all these lives are ruined in almost every country on the planet over herb, it's absolutely unacceptable. I just want to see everybody everywhere do what you can to move the needle. Even if you're traveling, you can go by a prison or something and give people anything, hope, some toothbrushes, some chocolate bars, you can visit people that have had troubles. I think it would be great to organize more of that, so that, and I don't even know where to start, but I mean, in every country, so many, there's people suffering for what we take for granted. And if there's a way to, at least get their names out there and get lists of these prisoners, because to me, they're prisoners of conscience, and I tried to force some hands, like in Zimbabwe, to get the government to release prisoners there. And they said, well, you know what? It's not crazy for cannabis, but a lot of these people are really bad people, that we have them for being murderers and thieves and stuff. I'm like, well, you can keep them for murder and thieves, but don't keep them for the weed. No, but they got longer sentences for the weed. That's not an excuse, but if you have any leverage anywhere, try and use it to speak up for those people, because it is just tragic. I'm just sick of it, really sick of it, to think of how many places there are people in hellholes because of some herb or some hash, whatever. It's just not acceptable. Anyways, these are a few of my thoughts on the matter. I just thought I'd ramble on because we've talked about it in bits and pieces, but I think it's important to give people the idea of depenalization, because I think legalization can really be a minefield. Decriminalization just doesn't do it. It's not enough. A good legalization would be great. A really reasonable, good legalization would be great. But more often than not, it's not what you'd hoped for. So depenalization, at the end of the day, that has to be the bottom line. Stop penalizing people for it. No charges, no fines. Just leave people alone with their gardens. That shouldn't be hard. It doesn't cost them anything to leave us alone. So these are my thoughts on legalization, decriminalization, and depenalization. So I hope that was somewhat enlightening. Probably not. But hey, thanks for coming out. Bye.